I was kicked out of the house while pregnant. For 10 years he pretended that neither I nor the children ever existed. But yesterday, in front of everyone, I showed up with the triplets. And before he could run away, I said it out loud. The award ceremony reached its peak. The orchestra had stopped playing a few minutes earlier, and all the attendees listened intently to Daniel Montenegro's emotional speech, the guest of honor for his achievements in the film industry. Dressed in an impeccable black tuxedo, his hair carefully slicked back, Daniel held the crystal trophy with both hands as he spoke about effort, sacrifice, and gratitude. But just as his words reached their climax, a tribute to his late mother, the main doors of the hall burst open with a dry crack that echoed throughout the room. Everyone turned at once. The cameras from the press shifted toward the entrance, alert. And then she appeared. Natalie. She walked in with her head held high, her gaze fixed on the stage as though she knew exactly where she was headed. She wore a dark red dress that clung to her figure with powerful elegance, but it wasn't her beauty or commanding presence that left everyone in awe. What took their breath away were the 3 children walking beside her, each clutching her dress, moving with confident strides. They looked exactly like Daniel Montenegro when he was 8 years old. The silence was complete. No one dared to speak. Natalie and the children moved slowly but surely, and with every step they took, the tension in the room grew. Daniel saw them and froze. From the stage, his face contorted in seconds. His triumphant expression twisted into a brutal mixture of surprise, fear, and something deeper, guilt. His eyes, which had just moments ago shone with pride, now widened as they locked onto the children's faces. He recognized those eyes immediately, his own. Natalie reached the center of the room and stopped just in front of the stage. She didn't speak at first. She simply gazed up at Daniel with a calm that didn't hide the firmness in her eyes. The children, one to her right and 2 to her left, stood still, chins high, lips tight, proud, brave. "Good evening, Mr. Montenegro," Natalie said, her voice clear and unwavering. "Congratulations on your award. Your children also wanted to congratulate you in person." The shock was instantaneous. Whispers began to spread like a shockwave. Some guests covered their mouths, others fumbled with their phones, recording with trembling hands. Journalists rushed from the sides, pushing each other to capture the moment. Daniel didn't respond. He couldn't. His lips parted, but no sound came. He stared at Natalie as if she were a ghost from the past. And in a way, she was. A security guard approached Natalie with his hand outstretched, ready to escort her out. But someone stood up from the front row and intervened. It was Chloe, Daniel's sister. Her face was tense, lips pressed together, and she raised a hand as a signal to stop. She didn't say anything, but the gesture was enough for the guard to halt. Natalie didn't step back. She took another step forward. "They have the right to know their father," she continued, her voice now more forceful. "The father who rejected them before they were born." The impact of her words was brutal, like a punch to the chest. Daniel took a step back, stumbling. The master of ceremonies from the side of the stage tried to intervene, announcing that the event would continue shortly, but his voice was drowned out by the growing ambient noise. No one was paying attention to his words. The bomb had been dropped, and it had exploded into 1,000 pieces. After the initial shock, as the gazes of the guests remained fixed on the scene they had just witnessed, Natalie turned with a calm that contrasted with the storm she had just unleashed. She grasped Michael's hand with her left, while her right hand guided Grace and John toward the exit. She didn't look back. There was no need to. What needed to be said had already been said. The murmurs didn't pick up again. No one had the courage to break the strange silence that hung in the air, as if the entire room were holding its breath. On the stage, Daniel remained frozen for a few more seconds, until someone from the production whispered to him that he should descend. He reacted as though waking from a nightmare. The flashes exploded around him once more, Reporters surrounded him instantly, pushing and shouting questions about Natalie's revelation, the children, the scandal. He barely saw them. He clumsily descended the stairs, unsure of where he was going. It was then that he felt a hand grip his arm tightly. "Did you really think this would stay hidden forever?" whispered Chloe, his sister, looking at him with a mixture of disappointment and contained rage. "Did you think she would never come back?" Daniel didn't respond. His mouth hung open, but no words came out. Meanwhile, outside in front of the theater, Natalie walked through a sea of cameras, flashing lights and microphones thrust toward her face. The children held their heads high, not letting go of her. She didn't dodge the press. She didn't seem afraid. A journalist with dark glasses and a sharp voice managed to get to the front. "Can you confirm that these children are really Daniel Montenegro's children?" Natalie stopped. She turned toward the camera as if she had been expecting this question for years. Her gaze was direct, her eyes dry. There was no anger, only truth. "Yes, and he knew it, and he kicked me out while I was pregnant." The words hit like lead. No one said a word for an eternal second. Then everything exploded. Phones were raised in seconds. Within 15 minutes, "G. Children of Montenegro" was trending across Latin America. The images of the children, Natalie and Daniel's pale face on stage, flooded social media. TV programs interrupted their regular programming with special bulletins. The flawless face of the film mogul began to crumble, crack by crack. Inside the black limousine parked outside the theater, Daniel sat without uttering a word. Outside, dozens of journalists pounded on the windows, calling his name. Inside the vehicle, his assistant was trying to explain the disaster unfolding on social media, the non-stop calls, the contracts in jeopardy. Daniel wasn't listening. He gazed out the window, eyes lost, as though looking for something that was no longer there. Chloe entered and slammed the door shut behind her. She stared at him for a few seconds before speaking. "You lied to everyone, to your team, your partners, even to me. How could you do this, Daniel?" He blinked slowly. When he responded, it was coldly. He was no longer the broken man from the stage. He was the strategist, the businessman, the Montenegro, as always. "I did what was necessary. I couldn't risk my empire over a youthful mistake." Chloe looked at him with disgust. "They weren't a mistake. They were your children." Kilometers away, in a small town with dirt roads and colorful houses in Springfield, the story was different. Natalie had returned home, and upon arrival, she was greeted like a heroine. Neighbors hugged her, the local children ran to meet the triplets, and some elderly folks cried as they watched her walk with her head held high. There, she was a symbol of something greater than a scandal. She was living proof of dignity and strength. She had never hidden. She had never lied. She raised her children with love, truth, and integrity. She told them who their father was from a young age, without drama or hatred. She told them that one day they would meet him, and that day had arrived. Michael, the oldest by minutes, would often repeat quietly what his mother had taught him. "We don't need him to recognize us. We just need him to look us in the eye and know who we are." If you're watching this far, I'm sure you're enjoying it, so I'd like to ask you to subscribe to the channel. The scandal erupted like gunpowder in the country's newsrooms. Within hours, the story of Natalie and the unrecognized children of Daniel Montenegro dominated the front pages of major newspapers. The father of cinema on the brink, Montenegro, the fall of an empire. Children of Montenegro, the truth he tried to hide. On television, news programs opened with images of the exact moment Natalie confronted the businessman at the ceremony. Social media became a relentless storm of opinions, memes, re-edited videos, and hashtags that never stopped trending. The credibility of the Montenegro group was at stake. At his mansion in Oak Ridge, Daniel paced back and forth, his phone pressed to his ear and his jaw clenched. Each call brought new pressure. Investors demanded explanations, executives cancelled meetings, and international studios requested a statement before the corporate image fell apart. In a video call, one of his oldest partners, Noah Aranda, raised his voice sharply. "We have to respond, now. We're being sunk in front of the whole country." Daniel took a deep breath. His hand shook slightly as he set the glass down on the table. "No, that would only make things worse." Noah looked at him in disbelief. "Are you admitting it's true?" Daniel didn't answer. He lowered his gaze and ended the call without another word. He knew perfectly well that Natalie hadn't lied, not a single word. And that gnawed at him more than any external threat could. It wasn't just the loss of prestige, it was the realization that, for years, he had built his empire on a lie. Meanwhile, on the southern side of the city, Chloe Montenegro knocked on the door of an old house painted light blue. Doña Eleanor, her mother, opened the door slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. "I need to talk to you." Chloe's voice was firm, blunt. In the living room, Chloe didn't wait to say what had been weighing on her since the truth came to light. "He destroyed his life, Mom. Natalie's life. Did you know?" Eleanor fell silent. She looked at an old family photo on the shelf, and her expression darkened. "Yes," she answered quietly, "and I was part of that. I did it to protect the family name, to avoid a scandal that in the end exploded anyway." Chloe closed her eyes for a moment, trying to hold back her anger. It wasn't just against her brother. It was against everyone who had covered for him. Far from there, on the set of one of the most watched television networks in the country, Natalie sat in front of the cameras, her face serene. In front of her, the star presenter Lucia Del Rio couldn't hide her emotion. "How was that moment?" Lucia asked. "When he left you?" "I was pregnant," Natalie interrupted, not raising her voice but with firm conviction. "He kicked me out with a suitcase and 100 pesos in my pocket. I lived in a cheap boarding house, washing clothes to support my children. I never asked for anything. I just wanted peace." Lucia fell silent, eyes welling up. The broadcast didn't cut. The camera director ordered to continue. The impact was too strong. "But I never played the victim. My children were my strength. And if I came back, it wasn't for revenge. It was for the truth to be known." In seconds, social media exploded again. The hashtag changed its tone. Now it was #Strength Natalie. Public opinion was on her side. Even celebrities and politicians began to openly express their support. At the Montenegro Group headquarters, executives gathered in the main office. Daniel walked in with a tense face. He hadn't slept. He wore the same suit from the day before. "We need a press conference," demanded one of the directors. "You have to take control, or the board will dismiss you. This is no ordinary crisis." Daniel sat in his black leather chair, not responding immediately. He gazed out the window at the city he once felt he ruled from above. But for the first time in his life, power wasn't enough. He felt fear, not from the scandal, not from the press, but from losing everything, what he had built, what he had hidden, what he had sacrificed. 3 days later, while the country was still digesting every detail of the Montenegro scandal, Natalie received an official envelope at her doorstep. It wasn't a court summons, but the letterhead of the General Prosecutor's Office was enough to understand the seriousness of the matter. It was a preliminary hearing for a paternity recognition lawsuit. No formal complaint had been filed yet, but the process was already underway. It was inevitable. Natalie held the document with both hands while her children played in the backyard. Her lawyer, Ignacio Trevino, read it with her, his expression solemn. "You're still in time to stop this, if you prefer to avoid the exposure," he said, his tone respectful. "You know this can escalate quickly." Natalie looked him in the eyes with determination. "I don't want a war. I want justice. They have the right to the truth, and he has the duty to accept it." Ignacio nodded. He knew Natalie wasn't motivated by revenge. She never had been. All she asked for was that her children be recognized for what they were, a legitimate part of a story that had been denied them for years. On the other side of the city, in the glass tower of the Montenegro group, Daniel listened to the news with a furrowed brow. His lawyers surrounded him in the meeting room. Several copies of the prosecutor's notice were laid on the table, along with a calendar of key dates. "The DNA test is the first step, Daniel. It's not a lawsuit yet, but if you reject it—" "I don't need that," he interrupted sharply. "I don't recognize those children as mine. I'm not going to be part of this circus." One of the younger lawyers took a deep breath before responding. "With all due respect, Mr. Montenegro, if you refuse the test, it will be interpreted as a tacit admission, and that, in the media, will leave you completely alone." Daniel fell silent. His pride burned in his throat, but he knew his lawyers were right. He had already lost ground. He couldn't afford to lose the narrative as well. Pressed, he agreed. The DNA test was scheduled for 15 days later. Once the news leaked to the press, because it always did, the reporters set up camp outside the announced clinic and in front of Natalie's house. When she learned of it, she made a quick decision to protect her children from the siege. She packed their things, put them in the car, and returned with them to the village in Springfield. At least there would be no photographers hidden in the bushes. But peace was no longer the same. The exposure had reached them, and the questions had too. One afternoon, while they were making cornbread with Doña Alice, the neighbor who had helped Natalie since she arrived in the village, Grace approached with a serious look on her face. "Mom, why doesn't he want us?" Natalie stopped stirring. She swallowed and bent down to her daughter's height. "Sometimes people are afraid of love. They're afraid of what they don't understand. But that has nothing to do with you, or with your brothers." Grace nodded thoughtfully. She didn't cry. She didn't make a scene. But the wound, silent, had already begun to mark her childhood. That same night, with the children already asleep, Natalie heard a truck stop in front of the house. She thought it would be some curious neighbor, but she was surprised to see Chloe Montenegro get out. She was dressed simply, without makeup, and her eyes were marked with deep, dark circles. "I need to talk to you," she said from the gate. Natalie let her in. She had no reason to hate her, but she also had no reason to trust her. They sat in the living room, a cup of coffee between them. Chloe didn't waste time breaking the silence. "I knew what Daniel did, from the beginning, but it wasn't just him," she sighed, holding back tears. "I followed our father's orders. He thought you were a threat to the family's reputation. He made me promise I'd take you out of the way." Natalie didn't respond immediately. She simply watched her. Her eyes weren't filled with hate, but with a resignation heavier than any anger. "Thank you for telling me. Now I understand, but I don't forgive." She stood up, walked to the door, and opened it without saying more. Chloe slowly got up. There were no hugs, no reconciliation, only truth, and the door that closed softly behind her. The day of the DNA test arrived. The private clinic in Clearwater was surrounded by cameras, reporters, and curious onlookers. Metal barriers and security agents kept the press away from the main entrance. Social media broadcasted every second live, as if it were a state event. At 10 o'clock sharp, a black van with tinted windows pulled up in front of the building. Daniel Montenegro got out of the vehicle, surrounded by his legal team, dressed in dark suits, with closed faces and briefcases in hand. They walked quickly, without looking around, as if the scandal didn't touch them. Natalie arrived minutes later, without bodyguards, without advisors. She wore a light-colored coat that contrasted with the formality of the place. She firmly held Michael's hand, while Grace and John followed in silence. Their steps were slow, but determined. She entered through the same door that had just minutes earlier been used by the man who had once rejected her. This time, there was no exchange of words, no greetings, not even a glance. The procedure was quick. Technically, it was just a sample collection, but the tension in the room was impossible to ignore. Daniel sat on the edge of his chair, staring at a fixed point on the wall, avoiding any eye contact. The children watched him from their corner. They didn't ask anything. They didn't show curiosity. They simply looked at him, with the long gaze of those who had never received an answer. The technicians were efficient. It took only a few minutes. Then each one went back the way they had come. Outside, the flashes erupted. "The Montenegro Triplets, family drama or business twist," read the headlines. No one knew for sure what was hidden behind that test, but everyone wanted the story. Meanwhile, far from the hustle and bustle, in a room at Hospital Angeles, Doña Eleanor had a relapse. Her blood pressure skyrocketed. Her breathing was short, her face soaked in cold sweat. The doctor was clear. It was accumulated stress. Years of silence, guilt, and bad decisions were now taking their toll. "She wants to see him," said the nurse. "Her son." Daniel arrived that same night. He sat next to the bed without taking off his coat. Eleanor, pale, turned her face with effort. "You built this empire," she said with a cracked voice, "but you lost your heart along the way." He didn't answer. He just looked at her. But inside, something stirred. He saw in his mother the same weakness he had always despised. But for the first time, he understood what she was feeling, maybe because now he too carried something he couldn't bury. 4 days later, the result arrived, 99.9% compatibility. Michael, Grace, and John were biologically the children of Daniel Montenegro. The news exploded like dynamite in the media. The shares of the business group fell 9% in a single day. Financial forums speculated about the stability of the company. In the boardroom, the partners were relentless. "This is not optional," said one of them. "You need to release an official statement, now." Daniel locked himself in his office. He wrote the statement with the coldness he had used to write all of his public speeches. There were no emotions, no responsibility taken with the heart. Just legal words, empty, obligatory. "I confirm that according to the official results from the laboratory, the minors, Michael, Grace, and John, are my biological children. I assume the responsibilities that the law determines according to the law." Nothing more. The text was published on all portals. It was read on television, shared on millions of profiles. In the house in the village, Natalie read it aloud. Then, in silence, she tore it into 4 pieces. "They don't need a name. They need a father," she said, looking out the window, with the children playing in the background. Then she simply stayed there, in silence. Weeks later, Natalie returned to the capital, but not as a victim or a secondary figure in the Montenegro scandal. She came back as a symbol. Her story, which had initially been shared on talk shows, was now the subject of magazine covers, panel discussions, and public forums. Invitations arrived every day: universities, foundations, government institutions. They wanted to hear her. They wanted to learn from her. Natalie, with her composure intact and without allowing exposure to corrupt her, accepted only what aligned with her principles. She founded the organization Luz de Vida, dedicated to maternal mental health and the emotional and institutional support of single mothers and children from marginalized communities. She used her visibility to build something greater than her story. In each event, she didn't just talk about herself. She talked about the thousands of invisible women, the ignored children, a system that had been silent for years. "I didn't come to claim what was never given to me. I came to offer what was taken from us for generations: voice, respect, and dignity." That phrase went viral. Single mothers, at-risk youth, even businessmen and public figures began to openly show their support. Natalie was no longer just the mother of Montenegro's children. She was the woman who had built a life from the ruins of public humiliation and who now offered light where there had once been darkness. Meanwhile, in Daniel Montenegro's world, the collapse was just beginning. What seemed to be a scandal over a denied paternity turned into an unprecedented storm. Former employees, initially anonymously, began to speak out to alternative media, revealing abuses within the company. What had been whispers for years was now being formally denounced. A former executive with access to internal documents delivered evidence to the prosecutor's office of contract manipulation, falsification of financial statements, and redirection of funds during the same period. Natalie had been expelled. Daniel had maneuvered to shield his family financially while destroying the life of the woman he secretly loved. The accusations piled up quickly. Within days, the prosecutor's office opened an official investigation for corporate fraud, accounting manipulation, and obstruction of justice. It was no longer just a moral issue. Now, Daniel faced the real possibility of prison. The fall was no longer merely symbolic. It was legal. It was definitive. Chloe, seeing the magnitude of the damage and feeling the weight of guilt, decided to step forward. She resigned from the Montenegro Group's board and called for a press conference. In front of dozens of reporters, with a voice broken but firm, she publicly apologized. "My loyalty was blind, and that cost lives. It cost dignity. I refuse to see the pain we caused. No more." The statement was met with respect and surprise. Chloe, until then a discreet figure loyal to the family name, had become the first to break the wall of silence from within. The effect was immediate. Strategic partners began to distance themselves from the conglomerate. Sponsors withdrew their support. And as if fate hadn't finished with him yet, Daniel's secret wife, a young woman with whom he had a 6-year-old daughter, filed for divorce and left the mansion, taking their daughter in her arms. Daniel, who had built a career on control, prestige, and silence, found himself finally staring into the mirror of his loneliness. No allies remained, no excuses. For the first time in decades, Daniel Montenegro was alone. Alone with the truth he had avoided for years. The investigation against him moved quickly. The prosecutor's office, led by a team of anti-corruption prosecutors, began summoning former employees, board members, and ex-partners of the Montenegro Group. Some arrived in fear, others with resentment, but all with stories that matched. Abuses of power, contract manipulation, silenced voices. For years, a machine had been built to cover up anything that would damage Daniel's image. Now, piece by piece, that machine was falling apart before the eyes of the country. Natalie was called as an indirect witness. Although she wasn't part of the company, her case had been the spark that ignited everything. She entered the prosecutor's office with the same determination that had guided her from the start. She carried only a folder with documents, photographs, and letters that had never been answered. She didn't ask for bodyguards or advisors. She simply asked to be heard. In front of the prosecutors, her testimony was clear, precise. She spoke of dates, conversations, people who knew. She named 3 executives by their full names. She explained how she was coerced into disappearing, how they sent her far away with a sum of money and a threat disguised as advice, how she was ignored when she wrote asking for help during her pregnancy. They knew. Everyone knew. And no one did anything, she said without raising her voice, but with a conviction that filled the room. The testimony was leaked to the press minutes later. Fragments of her statement spread across social media, accompanied by messages of massive support. Within hours, Natalie was trending again, but this time not for the scandal, but for what she represented. She became a symbol of female resistance against patriarchal and corporate structures that had silenced, displaced, and made invisible women like her. Feminist groups, NGOs, and even political figures used her image to inspire change. But while the country celebrated her, the reality at home was different. Michael, the eldest of the triplets, began showing signs of anxiety. He had trouble sleeping. His hands would sweat when he saw cameras or heard his father's name on TV. He had questions that no one could answer clearly, and although he tried to be strong for his siblings, his inner world was starting to fracture. Natalie, noticing the changes, acted without delay. She sought out a specialized center for children's emotional health and took them to therapy. Sitting in front of the psychologist, she confessed something she had never said out loud. They are strong, yes, but they are children. They need more than my strength. They need support, containment, and a childhood without fear. Meanwhile, Daniel, from his luxury apartment, decided to make a gesture. For the first time in weeks, he wrote something by hand. A letter, 4 brief paragraphs, without pretension, without excuses. He asked to speak with his children. He said he wanted to hear them. He asked for a chance. Natalie received the envelope in her mailbox. She opened it, read it in full, then wrote a brief note and returned it by the same means. If you want to talk to them, talk to me first. The children are not shields nor trophies. They are people. That night, Daniel was alone again. Sitting in his study with Natalie's letter on the desk, he flipped through an old box of photographs he had kept for years. He found an image that paralyzed him. Natalie, pregnant, standing on a beach, her rounded belly, eyes closed, smiling, as if she truly believed in the future. And for the first time, he cried, not because of the scandal, not because of the empire crumbling. He cried for what he had never allowed himself to feel. It wasn't guilt, not even regret. It was something deeper. It was the beginning of understanding. Days later, Daniel Montenegro appeared at the preliminary hearing of the criminal case against him. There were no statements to the press, no bodyguards, just him, flanked by his lawyers, walking silently through the halls of the courthouse. The press was kept outside, held back by barricades and shouts of indignation. For many, it was a historic moment. The country's most powerful man sitting as a defendant before the judiciary. Daniel looked different, thinner, his face drawn, his gaze lowered. No trace of the invincible businessman remained. The judge, after a brief outline of the charges, authorized a complete investigation into his fiscal and banking finances. His entire fortune would be reviewed. Accounts, transactions, contracts. What he had managed for decades from the shadows was now being exposed to the light of justice. Natalie didn't attend. She stayed at home, watching the broadcast from the kitchen TV, a cup of coffee in hand. She wasn't there for revenge, not out of curiosity, just to remind herself of how far she had come. She had survived, even when everyone had bet against her. Meanwhile, at the children's school, a small academic ceremony was taking place. It was family day, and each group had prepared brief presentations. Natalie arrived on time, her phone in hand to record. She sat in the 3rd row, nervous and excited. She wasn't thinking about trials. She wasn't thinking about hearings. She was only thinking about her children, about seeing them there, standing, smiling, being children despite everything. Michael played a song on the guitar. John read a poem about hope. And Grace, standing in front of the microphone with a firm and clear voice, recited a sentence that stuck in Natalie's chest. Family is the one that takes care of us, even when no one else does. Natalie closed her eyes for a moment, holding back tears. That sentence, so simple, was everything. Everything she had tried to build, everything she had defended, even with a broken heart. That night, as she prepared dinner, the phone rang with an unknown number. She hesitated to answer, but she did. The voice on the other end was enough to understand that the past had not finished knocking on her door. "Natalie, it's Chloe. I don't want to bother you. He really wants to talk to you. Only you. Please." Natalie didn't respond immediately. She hung up without giving an answer. Days passed. She didn't tell the children. She didn't seek advice. She simply thought. She felt. And then she decided. The meeting took place in a discreet cafe in the south of the city, without cameras, without assistants. Daniel arrived early. He was sitting at a corner table, a coffee untouched in front of him. When he saw her enter, he slowly stood up. He seemed like another man. His shoulders slumped, his face tired, his eyes showing a different shadow. Less arrogance, more humanity. "I can't change the past," he said as soon as she sat down. "But I have to face it. I'm ready to listen." Natalie looked at him for a long moment. Then she took a deep breath. "You destroyed me. You threw me away as if I were a mistake. And still, I continued. Not because of you, for them and for me." The conversation wasn't easy. There were no shouts, no reconciliation either. But they spoke for hours. About everything, about what was, about what couldn't be, about the silences, about the fears. They didn't seek agreements, only understanding. And when the sun began to set over the city and people started leaving the cafe, Natalie stood up. Daniel stood up too. They didn't hug. They didn't shake hands. They simply looked at each other one last time. Something new had begun. Not forgiveness, not a return, but perhaps the beginning of something more honest. Natalie made it clear from the beginning. Any type of contact with the children would be gradual, mediated, and with psychological support. There would be no improvisations, no spontaneous visits, no empty speeches. Daniel accepted without arguing. For the first time, he didn't try to negotiate or impose conditions. He simply listened and nodded. Perhaps because he understood that he was no longer the one calling the shots, they began with group sessions at a therapy center in the south of the city, a discreet place without big signs, but welcoming. The walls were decorated with children's drawings and phrases about empathy and healing. Daniel arrived early, dressed simply. Not the usual suit, but a wrinkled shirt and jeans that seemed foreign to his usual figure. Natalie entered a few minutes later, with the triplets. The children were silent. Michael with his eyes straight ahead, Grace holding a stuffed animal, and John, the quietest, walking with his hands in his pockets. The psychologist, a woman with a calm voice and a firm gaze, greeted them kindly. The first session was tense. No one knew what to say. Daniel discreetly sweated, his hands intertwined. The children didn't approach, but they didn't move away either. They sat, eyeing each other, unsure whether what they felt was curiosity, fear, or simple confusion. It was Michael who broke the silence. "Why didn't you want us?" The question fell like a stone in the middle of a calm lake. Daniel swallowed. His voice didn't come out immediately. He looked at Michael, then at Natalie, and finally lowered his head. When he spoke, he did so without embellishments. "Because I was weak and cowardly, and I thought I could erase you from my life. I was wrong." The psychologist jotted something down in her notebook. Natalie crossed her arms. Grace didn't say anything, she simply observed. John seemed absent, but he didn't move. None of the three stood up, no one ran away. And in the middle of that heavy silence, something small but valuable began to germinate. In the second session, Natalie remained on the sidelines. She watched them through the polarized glass of the monitoring room. Seeing Daniel like that, vulnerable, searching for words, clumsy in his gestures, was strange. She didn't feel compassion for him, but she understood that this process was necessary, not for him, but for the children, because they deserved it. Because it wasn't about redeeming the man who had abandoned her, but allowing the children to decide freely what place he would occupy in their lives. After the third session, John, who until then had barely spoken, approached Natalie as they walked to the car. "He talks just like me," he said without looking at anyone. It was the first time he acknowledged something of Daniel in himself. Natalie gently patted his head without saying anything. She knew that comment meant more than it seemed. The following week, they did something simple, a walk in the park. No cameras, no journalists, no rigid planning, just a walk, the four of them. Daniel bought them ice cream. John asked for the same flavor as him. Grace chased a dog. Michael allowed himself to smile. They weren't a family yet, but something was forming, something new, something that hurt and healed at the same time. At the end of the day, the psychologist spoke to Natalie privately. "They're opening up, but it's still fragile. Be careful with false hopes. Connection requires time and consistency." Natalie nodded. She knew. Inside, she was still doubting, still protecting herself. But she didn't close the door. She knew she couldn't avoid the scars, but she could stop them from bleeding. And although she didn't fully trust Daniel's intentions, she decided to continue. Not for him, for them. Always for them. The definitive fall of the Montenegro Empire didn't come with shouts or explosive headlines. It was silent, meticulous, like a crack that spreads until it completely shatters the ground. After months of investigation, the company was judicially intervened. A fiscal and corporate audit revealed years of irregularities, tax evasion, falsification of financial reports, and the diversion of resources to accounts abroad. The scandal was no longer personal. It had become a national crisis. The board of directors, pressured by international shareholders and regulatory bodies, voted unanimously. Daniel Montenegro would be removed from the presidency immediately. There was no ceremony, no farewell speeches, just a formal letter and an irrevocable decision. The chair he had occupied for decades was now empty. Chloe took over temporarily. Her face, once hidden behind the family name, now led press conferences and meetings with employees. In her first statement, she promised full transparency, internal audits, and a profound restructuring of labor policies. She also announced the creation of a community fund to support abuse victims within the company. "We're not trying to clean up an image. We're seeking redemption," she said with seriousness. "We can't change what we've done, but we can ensure it doesn't happen again." In one of those conferences, a journalist asked her if anyone had inspired her to take this step. The answer surprised everyone. Natalie was the one who opened our eyes. She exposed truths we needed to face, and for that, we are grateful. Daniel, from his apartment, watched it all on television. He didn't say anything at first. He just watched, the remote control in his hands. "I never thought I'd hear this. Chloe saying that Natalie was the salvation," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. While the company was undergoing its purge, something different was also transforming in the most intimate of settings. The meetings with his children became more frequent, still assisted by therapists, but less tense. Daniel began to arrive earlier, stay a little longer. Michael began to tell him stories about school, about his friends. John smiled more naturally, and although Grace still remained reserved, she no longer avoided him. One night, during a shared dinner at Natalie's house, Grace, with the brutal innocence of a child who has already seen too much, asked, "Would you have loved us if you had been with Mom?" Daniel froze for a few seconds. He took a deep breath. Then he spoke honestly. "Yes, but maybe I would have ruined everything because I didn't know how to love the right way." Grace lowered her gaze and nodded. She didn't respond, but she didn't shut down either. That silence wasn't rejection. It was understanding. Natalie from her seat noticed it, and that night when she returned to her room, she opened a file on her computer. The title was simple, Everything I Didn't Say. She began to write, not about Daniel, not about scandals, but about her journey as a mother, the nights of fever, the days without money, the small victories, her way of eternizing the fight. Luz de Vida, her foundation, was growing steadily. It expanded to other states and began receiving support from international NGOs interested in replicating the model. Natalie began giving talks outside of Mexico, at universities and social forums. Her story was no longer a media phenomenon. It was becoming a legacy. A major publishing house contacted her with an enticing proposal to turn her story into a television series. Natalie listened to them respectfully. She reviewed the contract. Then she closed it and returned it unsigned. "My life is too real to become entertainment," she said without hesitation. "There are truths that don't get edited." A week later, Natalie received an unexpected call. It was Chloe. Her voice, usually firm, sounded fragile. "My mother wants to see the children. She's very sick. The doctors said there's not much time left." Natalie fell silent, holding the phone in her hand. She didn't answer right away. She remembered well what Eleanor had done, what she had allowed, what she had silenced. But she also knew that of everyone in that family, Eleanor was the only one who had ever looked at her with tenderness. She hesitated. She thought about it for hours. And finally, she said yes. The meeting took place at the house where Eleanor spent her last days. It was a modest room, filled with soft light and old photographs. Michael, Grace, and John entered hand in hand. They didn't know who this pale woman was, with the grey hair braided, lying between pillows. They didn't know whether to hug her, greet her, or just look. Eleanor broke into tears when she saw them. With effort, she sat up a little and extended her trembling hands. "Forgive me," she whispered. "You are the best part of me, the only thing that matters in this story." The children didn't respond. They approached slowly. John gave her a flower he had picked on the way. Grace took her hand without saying anything. Michael, serious, simply nodded. It was a brief, contained moment, but filled with an odd peace. Eleanor closed her eyes with a tired smile, as if that visit had been the last unresolved matter. Days later, Eleanor passed away. Daniel received the news while alone. He didn't scream. He didn't break anything, but inside, he cracked. She was his mother, the only one who knew all his fears, all his mistakes, the only one who had witnessed his fall and still called him my boy. The funeral was discreet, with no media or statements. Natalie arrived with the children dressed in sobriety. Not for Eleanor, nor for Daniel, but out of respect for the story. For what came before. For the roots, even if they were broken. When Chloe saw her walk in with the children, she approached and hugged her tightly. "You are nobler than all of us put together," she whispered, with tears in her eyes. Natalie didn't respond. She simply smiled faintly. A tired smile, but at peace. After the burial, Daniel disappeared. There were no calls. He didn't attend the sessions with the children. He didn't respond to messages. He locked himself away for weeks. He cried for his mother, yes, but also for himself, for the image he had built, for the identity that no longer belonged to him. He was in mourning for everything. Natalie kept the routine with the children, school, workshops, family time. She tried not to speak of Daniel, but she didn't avoid him either. When they asked about him, she responded honestly, without drama. "What we sow one day blooms," she would say while serving dinner, unaware that at that very moment, something was beginning to bloom inside Daniel. One day, John ran out of school, waving a piece of paper. "Look what I made." It was a drawing, the 5 of them holding hands, Natalie, Daniel, himself, Grace, and Michael, smiling. "It's our new family." When Daniel saw it days later, he broke into tears. Not an uncontrollable cry, but one that was deep, contained, one of those that come from deep within. John didn't comfort him. He simply sat next to him, still holding the drawing. The therapist, seeing the change, suggested something new. A weekend together, away from the city, without structure, without filters, just them. Daniel trembled at the thought, but accepted. They were ready to try. Natalie would go too. "They are your children, but they are my life. Never forget that," she said before getting into the car that would take them to that small beginning. The weekend in Burlington began with a strange silence. It wasn't tense, but neither was it comfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes when stepping into new territory, still uncertain. The country house chosen by the therapist was surrounded by greenery, with large windows offering a direct view of the hills. It was simple, warm, without luxury. Just what they needed, space to breathe, far from the noise of the world. From the moment they arrived, the children ran to explore the corners. Michael found a hammock. John stayed fascinated by the carved stones in the garden. Grace walked closer to Natalie, silently observing. Daniel arrived later, with a small backpack and a restrained expression. He wasn't sure whether to smile, embrace, or simply be. He chose the latter. The next day they went for a walk through the town center. The cobbled streets, the white houses with tiled roofs, the flowered balconies, everything had a timeless feel. Daniel looked at each building with a mixture of nostalgia and something deeper, regret. He had never walked through this town calmly. He had always been busy, hurried, wrapped up in his own plans. Now he walked behind his children, trying to learn again how to look at the world. Natalie led the walk naturally. She explained the origins of the town to the children, its legends, its struggles. She told them about the old miners, the temples that resisted through the centuries, and how every stone held a story of effort and rebirth. "Every street," she said, "has scars, and still it stands, just like us." In a park near the Parroquia de Trinity, the triplets began to play. At first, they kept their distance. Then, little by little, between soft laughter, they let go. Daniel watched them from a bench, as though trying to memorize every movement. John surprised him with an unexpected laugh. Grace watched him from the corner of her eye. Michael threw him a ball in a discreet manner. It wasn't full acceptance, but it was a beginning. Later, while the children ate ice cream at a kiosk, the conversation that Daniel had been dreading finally came up. Natalie was direct. "If we're going to continue with this, if we're going to form something close to a family, it has to be with transparency. No reservations." Daniel lowered his gaze. The words were hard for him to speak, not because of pride, but because of the fear of getting them wrong. I need to learn how to love properly, without fears, without the lies of the past." Natalie didn't respond. She just nodded, looking at how the first drops of a gentle rain began to fall, enveloping the city. It was a warm rain, almost poetic, as if the sky too was seeking to cleanse something. They all hurried back to the house, drenched but laughing. That night, the house was filled with a different warmth. Not because of the weather, but because of the closeness. Between simple dinners and cups of hot chocolate, they began to share personal stories. Natalie spoke of the boarding house she had lived in for years. John shared his fear of the dark. Daniel spoke, for the first time, about how it was to grow up under the demands of his father. They weren't trying to move each other, they were just connecting. The therapist, observing the dynamic, suggested something new, a collective journal. Each person would write something after each meeting, an emotion, a phrase, a memory. It was a way to process, to record not only the events, but also what everyone felt. Michael wrote the first entry. "Today, we were a little family, but real. And the atmosphere was full of reconciliation, yes, but also caution. They all knew that rebuilding trust wasn't an event, but a process. Long, irregular, painful, but possible. Back in Mexico City, reality waited without pause. Just a week after the trip to Burlington, the repercussions of the judicial intervention in the Montenegro company began to be strongly felt. It wasn't just an administrative change. It was an earthquake shaking financial foundations, international contracts, and political alliances that had been carefully built over decades. The shares of the companies linked to the group fluctuated with every new headline. Investors, once silent, now demanded public explanations and contingency plans. Chloe, at the head of the board, faced a media and economic storm, but she didn't hide. She called a press conference where she announced a new governance model based on ethics, transparency, and social responsibility. She implemented external audits, reformulated internal codes of conduct, and dismissed several executives involved in irregularities. "We're not trying to save a name, we're trying to restore meaning," she said in front of the cameras with a firm voice. "And for that, the change must be profound, not just aesthetic." The media quickly picked up every move. Newspapers, digital portals, newscasts, all followed the case like a high-rating soap opera. Montenegro in decline, the empire crumbles as the truth comes to light, the Financial Times headline read. Columnists debated the weight of truth against power. The entire country seemed to be involved. Meanwhile, Daniel faced a silent but devastating trial, the trial of public opinion. On social media, every past mistake was dissected, ridiculed, archived forever in viral videos. TV programs analyzed his figure as a symbol of what power hides. A former mogul, now a cautionary tale. Natalie, on the other hand, was living an unexpected contrast. Her story, once the subject of scandal, was now a source of inspiration. She received invitations from universities, social organizations, and feminist study centers. At every conference, she shared her story not with anger, but with a firm calm that disarmed the audience. "Truth sets you free," she declared in an interview for El Universal. "The courage to face the past builds the future." The phrase became a quote in articles, publications, and even murals in schools. It wasn't fame that she sought, but she had become a reference. And with each appearance, she made it clear that her cause was bigger than her. The triplets, now more secure, continued their therapy process. Each one moved at their own pace, under the constant support of child psychologists. They worked on trust, self-image, and their relationship with their father. Grace still reserved, John more open, and Michael increasingly protective. Natalie observed everything closely, without intruding, but without disappearing. The pressure on Daniel intensified with a new media blow. An investigative documentary series aired by an international platform dedicated an entire episode to the Montenegro case. With testimonies, reconstructions, and data, the program revived every mistake, every complicit silence. It was a violent echo of a past that still hadn't finished being atoned for. In his apartment, Daniel lived in seclusion. Surrounded by marble, art, and wide windows, he faced long, empty nights. Nightmares visited him frequently. In them, he wasn't the arrogant businessman. He was a man alone, staring at versions of himself to whom he could no longer speak. He reflected. He cried. And he stayed silent. Yet amidst all that chaos, something faint began to rise. It wasn't redemption, not yet, nor forgiveness, but a small hope of change, of reconstruction, an inner light that, though fragile, didn't want to be extinguished anymore. But just when it seemed like the storm was calming, an unexpected twist shook everything once again. During an independent audit, commissioned by the new management of the Montenegro Group, one of the auditors found a folder filed under a false name. The contents were explosive: correspondence between Daniel and a former partner, altered contracts, and signed documents detailing how Natalie had been manipulated into being removed from the business and social scene when she became pregnant. These weren't assumptions. They were facts. Dates, signatures, transfers, explicit orders. It was the truth, written, sealed, filed, and forgotten, until now. Chloe was notified immediately. She called an emergency board meeting. When it was over, she addressed the media in a brief but powerful press conference. These documents confirm that deliberate acts of exclusion, manipulation, and abuse of power were committed. All those involved will have to answer to justice. No more impunity, not even within this family. The news exploded across social media. Newscasts broke their regular programming to cover it. Digital newspapers changed their headlines in real time. The Natalie case. Documents confirm business conspiracy, Millionaire headlined. The legal pressure on Daniel increased dramatically in a matter of hours. It was no longer just testimony, now it was proven facts. Natalie, upon seeing the news on screen, felt something she hadn't experienced in years: relief. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and let that emotion fill her body. "Truth," she said in a brief interview, "finally wins. For years I lived under the shadow of secrets and betrayals. Today, that shadow begins to dissipate." Daniel, for his part, didn't try to deny it. He couldn't. The signatures were his. The orders were his. The plan, cold and effective, had come from his own hand. Now, it was chasing him. He was summoned by the prosecutor's office to testify in a new legal process that not only threatened his reputation, but his freedom. At the preliminary hearing, the judge overseeing the case was direct and severe. Justice does not forgive anyone. The mistakes of the past must be repaired with actions in the present, and you, Mr. Montenegro, have a debt that cannot be paid with press releases or public tears. The courtroom was packed. Some sought justice, others revenge. Social media became polarized. For many, Natalie was a national heroine. For others, she was a brave woman who exposed the system. But there were also voices calling for an exemplary punishment for Daniel, with no possibility of redemption. Amidst the storm, Michael, Grace, and John found refuge at school. Teachers, attentive to their progress, reinforced in class the values of forgiveness, empathy, and the ability to rebuild what is broken without repeating mistakes. Natalie, aware of the moment the country was living through, decided to write an open letter. It was published in several media outlets and shared thousands of times. "We don't ask for hate. We ask for justice with humanity. Punishment alone doesn't heal. Redemption exists when pain turns into learning. Don't let anger erase our ability to believe in change." The words resonated. They were read by students, officials, ordinary citizens. Some cried, others debated, but no one remained indifferent. That revelation of the documents marked an irreversible turning point. The line that divided truth from silence had already been crossed. And with it, the course of justice was now moving forward relentlessly, marked by names, dates, and a legacy that could no longer be ignored. The crucial hearing arrived in the midst of national tension. The streets near the courthouse were surrounded by cameras, journalists, and citizens demanding answers. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was even denser. Daniel Montenegro, dressed in somber attire and visibly affected, sat at the center of the scene. Around him, former partners, ex-directors of his company, and even members of his own family waited their turn to face the judge. For the first time, everyone would be forced to account for their actions. Witnesses began to testify, one by one. Former employees, personal assistants, even accountants revealed how the conspiracy to remove Natalie from the scene had been orchestrated. They spoke of secret meetings, veiled threats, and falsified documents meant to protect the business interests of the group and the family honor. Every word shattered the image of the untouchable Montenegro. Chloe was called to the stand. She walked to the center of the room with her head held high, but her eyes were visibly red. Her voice, though firm, trembled from within. "I also failed," she declared. "I failed by not protecting what was right. I followed orders. I convinced myself that silence was safer, but it wasn't. The truth must prevail, even when it hurts." The murmur among the attendees was immediate. It was the first time a Montenegro had publicly broken down, not as a victim, but as a co-conspirator. Both sides presented their arguments with a force that even legal analysts found surprising. Recordings, bank records, recovered emails. The defense tried to minimize the damage, but the avalanche of evidence was difficult to stop. The narrative of the trial was turning into a family drama, with the weight of betrayal and the search for redemption marking every minute. Natalie watched from an annexed room, protected from the media frenzy. She didn't need to be in the spotlight. Her battle had started years ago, and seeing those responsible face the consequences was enough. She was there for herself, yes, but also for all the women who had ever been silenced, displaced, or made invisible by the power structures. The children, still too young to fully understand the magnitude of what was happening, were cared for by specialized therapists. They were explained in simple words what justice, repair, and truth meant. John asked if his father would go to jail. Grace wondered if that meant they would never see him again. Michael didn't say anything, but his silence spoke louder than any question. Daniel was called to testify. He stood up with difficulty, his face pale, his hands trembling. He approached the microphone and for the first time spoke without a script or legal advice. "I made a mistake," he said, "and if I have to pay for it, I will. Not to redeem myself in front of you, but to take the first step towards something I should have done years ago, face myself." The judge listened attentively. Then, with a severe tone, he responded, "Justice does not forgive anyone. The mistakes of the past must be repaired. It is not enough to admit them. One must face them with all their consequences." And just when it seemed like everything had been exposed, one of the partners stood up. He carried a new folder. The contents surprised everyone. Evidence of an even deeper corruption scheme linked to government contracts, bribes, and political protection. The room erupted in murmurs. The judge called for order. This new revelation added a new chapter to a story that had already become too complex. But it also confirmed something essential. This trial was no longer only about Daniel. It was about a system that, for years, had allowed everything to happen. And as the words echoed in the courtroom, like bells announcing the inevitable, the atmosphere thickened with a painful new beginning. Every phrase, every testimony sounded like the echo of a different dawn, no longer dark, no longer silent, but one where, finally, everything came to light. The court issued its sentence a week later. The room was completely silent when the judge read the ruling. Guilty. All those involved in the scheme that had marginalized Natalie and covered up years of corporate corruption would face exemplary sentences. It was a historic moment, not only for the Montenegro family, but for the country. The cycle of impunity was broken with a firmness that resonated beyond the walls of the courtroom. Daniel received his sentence. There were no protests or pleas. He stood as the judge spoke, his gaze lowered. His family watched from the second row, Chloe, broken but firm, and Natalie, serene, without bitterness. The family ties, though shattered for so long, were now timidly beginning to weave together again, but this time from the truth. Natalie, when she left the courtroom, did not make any statements. She walked with firm steps toward the car waiting for her. She had much to do. The Luz de Vida Foundation was growing without stopping, bringing psychological support and empowerment programs to women all over the country. She had turned pain into purpose and her story into a lesson for future generations. The triplets, now teenagers, walked beside her. They were no longer children. They had lived enough to understand that their father was neither a villain nor a hero, but a human being full of contradictions. Seeing him fulfill his sentence pained them, yes, but it also awakened in them a hope that change was possible, even in someone who had failed the most. In a final family meeting authorized by the judge, Natalie and Daniel locked eyes for a few seconds. They didn't say much. They simply looked at each other for the last time. Something new had begun. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but perhaps the start of something more honest. The media aired their last special. The Montenegro saga comes to an end. The truth finally unleashed, justice served, forgiveness begun. Mexico City was abuzz with the news. For many, it marked the beginning of a new era where wounds were no longer hidden. That night, Natalie wrote in her journal, "Forgiving is not forgetting. It is freeing yourself from the weight of the past to build a worthy future." She closed the journal and smiled, looking at her children sleeping. In his cell, Daniel murmured quietly, promises of change, words of regret. No one heard him. Only he did. And for the first time, that was enough. And so, the story ended. A painful cycle came to an end, and another began, full of possibilities, where truth, courage, and love finally found their way.